The category isn't your brand. The category is this open idea. So when you're having a conversation about a category, it's the problem, it's the thing out there. It sits above the brand or the item or the device or the wearable.
On this week's episode, we welcome to the tank Peter and Deborah from Category Design Company to discuss the world of category design and the strategy around defining and dominating new markets. We dig into the process of becoming a category king and the key traits shared by some of the most successful category kings across industries. Peter and Deborah share some practical steps companies should take when pursuing category design, along with some real-world examples and case studies, along with some common pitfalls and how to avoid them. Whether you're a startup looking to carve out a niche or an established company aiming to innovate, this episode is packed with insights and strategies to help you master the art of category design. But before we jump into this week's interview, we welcome back to the tank John Ruffalo to discuss the news and stories making headlines in the tech and venture capital ecosystem. Thanks for jumping the tank today, John. How you been?
Great, man. How are you?
I'm good. Lots of headlines to cover today. First off, return to office is still happening across corporate America. Next up is Amazon CEO Andy Jassy addressing an internal letter outlining steps to return the office 5 days a week, mandating their executives in Seattle return in the new year, starting at 5 days a week from their current 3 days a week. And he also highlighted, the reasons for this around inefficiencies, excessive meetings, layers of management, and actually set up a bureaucracy mailbox for employees to report unnecessary meetings. Mandating these 5 days back to the office set a chord for a lot of people. Struck a chord with a lot of their employee base. First off, what do you think of this? Is it about time? And do you think this is something they're addressing because the numbers are not looking so good and they're saying that's a drag on innovation? What are your thoughts?
My cynical hat says that Andy is a very, very smart individual. And I suspect this is a great way how to save a lot of severance costs in that they need to scale down. They got very, very fat during COVID, like many of the tech companies, and they really haven't had the big wholesale slimming down of the organization. I think that they're going to expect a lot of folks to have no choice but to raise their hand. The thing that I'm a big supporter of is that there's a beautiful part about being in a free enterprise society. If you don't like it, you should leave and go to an organization that's more culturally aligned to what you want to do. But the equal side is if the management feel that this is the best way to operate their company, they have the full right to do so as well. This is no surprise. A lot of organizations have abandoned fully remote unless you're very, very small. I'd say most of the organizations have adopted a hybrid environment where you're going 3 or 4 days a week. I think the reality is if you are showing up 3 or 4 days a week, I don't think they're going to be overly offended, but I think what they are weeding out is folks who are just not showing up at all. And they just said, you know what, we got to get rid of few folks. And one of the things that I've said early on is the combination of the two is very, very difficult to manage. And it's a little bit of out of sight, out of mind. And when it's time for promotions, etc., there will be a human tendency to build a relationship with those that they physically see. And this is not a surprise at all.
No, I think you're right. It's interesting they're starting with HQ in Seattle, though, as the first place they're going to do it before rolling it out globally. And I'm wondering if it's because they think if they can showcase that they can get the executives back, everything trickles down from there. Whereas if they did a corporate-wide return to office 5 days a week, then it would create a lot of friction in getting it back. So maybe they're doing it one bite at a time. But the funny thing is this bureaucracy mailbox. I mean, first off, who has access to this mailbox? Because if you're getting inbox mail and you're the ones reviewing it about meetings that you're requesting, that is going to be a huge shit show for somebody there. But I'm just like, how much crap are they going to get in this mailbox?
Well, it sounds rather bureaucratic, doesn't it?
It does. It does sound very bureaucratic, and they call it the bureaucracy mailbox. So we'll see how that works out. But another thing that made headlines here this week was obviously Elon getting into it with some Canadian politicians over the government's approval of over $2 billion to a Canadian company called Telesat for a $2.14 billion Canadian loan, with an additional $400 million from government of Quebec to support the development of a low Earth orbit, light speed satellite network. heard of a company that's done this before. I'm a subscriber to it and I love it. But this is apparently Canada's version of Starlink. So this project now they're claiming is going to be high-speed internet for rural areas with 5G services as well across Canada and create thousands of jobs, pledging a lot of economic contributions, investment in jobs and scholarships and local manufacturing through MDA in Quebec. I mean, this is corruption at its most basic level, I think. But you tell me here, do they have any argument for why they should not be spending half the $2 billion on just giving this to a system that's already up and running and has way more coverage than Telesat will probably ever offer Canadians?
Well, man, let me just start off with my bias. As you know, I really believe that Canadian crown corporations can be the most innovative organizations in Canada. As you know, that's proven never to be the case. I was being facetious here. This public policy of giving handouts, and in particular to crown corporations, this is such old school industrial thinking again. Now, if I like the idea of either if you find the best in the world, or there are some interesting private companies in Canada that might be a lot smaller. If the Canadian government was concerned about this, the greatest way to give a handout is not by giving a handout, but by being a customer. And if there is a Canadian government procurement opportunity that gives a kickstart to a Canadian-based company, I am all for it because you're using market forces and you're creating capacity in Canada. Otherwise, what we end up with is, again, a crown corporation playing in this game here. It's not a disservice to Telesat, but they got a long way to go from a technology perspective. And then you do have an existing organization that could solve your problem immediately at half the cost, and yet we dismiss it outright. Are we dismissing it because Elon is not known to be very quiet? And is this more of a political issue, or is this the right thing for Canadian consumers, or is this the right thing for Canadian capacity? It just feels that this solution in here doesn't really achieve the objectives other than another multi-billion-dollar handout. When are we going to stop this? The ultimate result of this is going to, again, be higher and higher taxes to pay for all of these handouts.
I think that the biggest thing that always frustrates us as taxpayers is why are we held as executives or business owners to a different standard than the government is held to on the ROI of the investments they make with our dollars? Is anyone going to look at this and say, okay, well, you're saying the first satellites are going to go up in 2026, and if you miss that deadline, what are the repercussions? What are the repercussions if you miss that promise, basically? Sign an agreement that says you'll do it. If not, then you have to switch to another provider. I mean, we're seeing this over and over with obviously a lot of Elon's projects, whether it's the government giving Boeing a loan to get the, idiots off the space station, or not giving Elon a fair shot at bidding on something like this. I mean, first off, getting the satellites up into space are probably going to happen through a SpaceX launch anyways, right? So you're really just short circuit the process and give Canadians what they need. And then they also said that this has military applications.
Yeah.
What military applications? Right? Like, we don't have a military. So, and I'm being facetious as well, but I just mean, like, if that is your concern, then carve out certain aspects to it, right? Don't blanket this.
Yeah, maybe I should give them the email for Kepler Communications here in Toronto and let them know.
Exactly.
Let them know that there's a great Canadian company right here in your midst that is a lot further ahead than Telesat.
Yeah. Well, let's stick with the government theme here. The Business Development Bank of Canada, BDC, has promoted Genevieve Bouthier to Executive Vice President of BDC Capital, making her the head of Canada's largest venture capital investor. She will replace Jerome, who left unexpectedly after more than a decade in the role. And now, obviously, with her 20 years of experience in finance and investment, she will oversee BDC Capital's portfolio, which includes direct investments in startups, funds like ours, as well as federal programs like the Vicky Venture Capital Catalyst Initiative. So what are your thoughts here, stepping into a leadership role at BDC Capital in a tough time for VC fundraising? What kind of strategies do you think they can use to navigate sort of the market we're in right now?
there seems to be a number of wholesale changes going on at BDC. I do wish Genevieve the absolute best. I guess there was another departure of Thomas Park just this week as well. Yet Allison, before that, when you start to add up the institutional knowledge that's disappeared on a cumulative basis in a very, very short period of time, that's either A, troubling, or B, is the start of a different strategy. One of the interesting examples of a bold strategy that's, I thought has been done incredibly well has been the EDC. When Merid took the helm and we had a long call on strategy, she really wanted to pivot them, focused in on growth, not competing against the market, but actually supplementing the market and filling in a specific hole where the risk profile of the investments was too great for the private sector. And I've got to give them an A+ grade. They have really nailed the strategy. I think when you look at BDC, there is a lot of confusion in the marketplace of where exactly are they positioning themselves. And, perhaps with all of these changes, there's going to be a far clearer positioning of where they're heading and how it's going to support the market, support the capital sources. Again, I think the jury is going to be out until, you'll probably see a successive number of leadership changes there before their new strategy, if there is a new strategy, is going to be executed.
Yeah, that's an interesting point around obviously what EDC did well to supplement the market instead of running alongside a lot of the supporters they had. Obviously, BDC marked down the value of its VC portfolio by $220 million due to the market volatility. And there is a lot of confusion around which mandate is taking the lead maybe at BDC at certain times. And so maybe having a lot more clearer messaging to the market could be something that Genevieve puts in place, which is a great idea. So I think that's a really good idea. And maybe they'll give us a call and see what we think of it as strong partners in the ecosystem. Next thing I want to talk to you about, John, is these IPO markets. They've been stagnant for 2 years. The Fed just cut the rates. So hopefully we're going to start to see a little bit more opening up of the window. But VCs are finding more creative ways to return cash to their LPs, right? Firms are increasing ways of doing secondary sales of either LP stakes or secondary sales of individual companies, continuation funds, and, even the good old crypto guys are turning to staking to generate some liquidity on those assets they have rid down 99%. So in your eyes, what are your thoughts here? Are you seeing a lot of this around secondary sales and continuation funds? And, for those who don't understand continuation funds, they basically are a continuation of that 10-year fund life that most VC funds have, even though some have a plus, 1, 2, or 3 year extension to them. So in the later years of a fund's life, without being forced to sell, certain LPs can sell and generate liquidity, and then other LPs either roll into the continuation fund and new investors buy those LPs out from that first fund. Do you think these synthetic distributions might be undermining sort of trust between venture capitalists and their LPs? What are your thoughts on these secondary strategies you're seeing out there?
Yeah, this is a complex topic, so I've got to just kind of hit a few of the key points. The strategies that have worked for a long time is the secondaries market. So this is the market in the most classic sense, where let's just say you're in a buyout private equity fund. You have one asset left. You've monetized the rest. And your LPs, they want the capital back so they can continue to redeploy new funds. Well, there's lots of funds out there that will buy, in particular, single investment stakes. They look for a little bit of a discount, but it gets liquidity. And that's a very important mechanism. Or B, if I'm an LP and I have stakes in 10 funds, but I really want to consolidate to 7, and I could sell my interests in the remaining 3. Again, good for liquidity. Where it starts to break down is, I think, continuation funds. I do think it is contrary to the interests of LPs. I am actually personally against it, and you could hold me accountable that I actually think it screws LPs. I used to be on that side of the table, and it's wired against you in that if you said these were going to get me liquidity, say over a period of 10 years, and you're cherry picking certain ones to extend the life and collecting more fees, it really is a way to get more fees and reset the clock. So I'm not a huge fan of that. Now, what you've said is relatively new is the very large funds like the Sequoias and Reasons. I believe Insight's doing the same thing. They're creating internal markets for liquidity of certain investors that want to come in, certain that want to go out, etc. It's interesting, but it's also largely you're able to do it when you have massive capital pools. So for the average fund, they're not going to be able to partake in it. And one thing it is doing, those innovative funds, it actually is decreasing the pressure to ultimately go public. So I actually think it's going to continue the trend of keeping companies longer private and maybe forever. And you're seeing this right now. Which one is it now? I'm forgetting which one's now saying it's not Klarna, but they're saying, well, you know what? If I have this
Stripe,
is it Klarna or somebody announced very recently? Well, we don't feel the pressure of going public now, and we can continue to satisfy our employees and our investors by using these mechanisms and never ever going public again.
Yeah, the tender offers and things like that, the Stripe tender offers, the SpaceX tender offers, for sure. I think just to play devil's advocate on the continuation fund side, not that I'm supportive of it either, but just so you know, like LPs don't have to join the continuation fund. It's an option. I think what you're saying is that if you're cherry picking the best assets that roll into the continuation fund and an LP is not getting necessarily the option to ride those two, they have to kind of go into a continuation fund to see that through. Are they realizing the full value at the time that fund reaches its end of life and the continuation fund takes over that asset? I see your point there. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
When you have to make a selection. Some you hold back and some you continue. And if they have different investment pools in there, somebody might be screwed on that. And frankly, let's go back and eventually evaluate the success of these continuation funds. And the reality is your hottest companies do exit out earlier. Your biggest dogs go bankrupt. So you end up with these kind of in-betweeners. And it's not exclusively, but on average, it ends up with they're okay, they cash flow or they barely cash flow, etc.
Lifestyle businesses almost,
Yeah. So that's why I just say, deal with it and suffer the pressure. If you are a GP and you haven't done the exit, hey, figure it out.
Absolutely. Just the same way we tell our founders. Understood. Before we wrap up, John, I got to ask you, obviously being, Toronto and obviously sports fans, I'm sure there's some big news that happened in Canada with one of Canada's oldest companies, BCE, selling its stake of 37.5% in Maple Leaf Sports Entertainment to Rogers Communications, their biggest competitor, for $4.7 billion, giving Rogers a majority ownership of 75% of the Toronto sports team market. So that includes the Maple Leafs, the Toronto Raptors, the Toronto Argonauts, and the Toronto FC Football Club. So soccer. So Bell, obviously decided to sell its stake to pay down its debt, which is pretty big, and focus purely on its telecom business. And this values MLSE at $12.5 billion, which is a record for Canadian sports franchises, obviously. So, now that Rogers already owned their stake prior to this, they're now the largest owner alongside the Kilmer Group or Laird Tannenbaum. What do you think? What do you think this means, though, in terms of the sports market as well as the telecom market and the future of Bell? Because your good friend Mark McQueen said this may bring back the 2007 private equity takeover opportunity that fell apart during the global financial crisis for Bell.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but I was musing when I read that as well too. But here is the reality: Bell has maintained its aggressive dividend. They were dividending out again. I don't have the numbers in front of me.
It was like 8.5 or 9%.
Yes, on that yield, it's a zero growth. It was paying in excess of its free cash flow. And so this was an unsustainable model. And I don't think there's a coincidence of selling this as interest rates have come down to get the valuation higher, to relieve the pressure of the indebtedness. I don't think they really wanted to do this, but they had to for the longevity of Bell. So I'd say, Bell's future, yes, it's got extended. And the one thing that they did was good is they negotiated the 20-year distribution right, which I thought that was good, or else they would have nailed their CTV TSN situation. So now on the Rogers side, good for Rogers now, but at the same time, having one owner of all of these sports franchises, again, is that a good thing? It's generally not. Just as a general rule, you like to have competitive pressures, but I could see that Rogers took advantage of a great situation and now own all of the premier assets in each of the leagues in the country. So, good for them.
Yeah, good for Rogers. Obviously, I mean, shitty probably for fans out there, having a corporate owner like that. And you're right, the dividend for BCE is sitting at the yield right now. Dividend yield is 8.38%, still very high. It's with their debt. Obviously, they're going to pay down if this deal does get approved. But interesting to see this happen right now in this market. Well, we'll have to wait and see till next time, John. But thanks for jumping in the tank today.
All right, thanks, buddy.
Now let's jump into the tank for this week's episode with Peter and Deborah. Thanks for joining us in the tank today, Peter and Deborah.
Hey.
Psyched to be here.
Excited.
We're super pumped to have both you on the show today because I think a lot of our listeners will really enjoy the topic that we're going to be discussing today regarding category design. But before we jump in, it would be great if we can give our listeners a brief background on both your stories, where you grew up, where you went to school, and your early career days. And maybe we'll kick things off with you, Deborah, and then we'll jump over to Peter.
I'm from Los Angeles, born and raised. I'm a serial entrepreneur. My father was a clothing manufacturer, so that's where I cut my teeth, I guess. So trend, styles, the intersection of action, trends, visuals, and I did that for a number of years. I also have a double master's in social work and gerontology. I've been in the music industry. I was early on in the internet. Basically, the through line to all my stuff is I've followed my passions. And when there was something new breaking, I tended to immerse myself in it. And early on, I've been going to the TED conferences for over 25 years. I had a live events company, virtual events, and I met Peter through the virtual TED.
I was born in Toronto and grew up there. I went to Queen's University, where I have a Bachelor of Commerce. And then I started off in consumer packaged goods. So I was at Procter & Gamble for a few years and then moved into tech and spent 35 years in software. Moved down to California about 24 years ago. I've worked on both sides of the border. I've done mostly B2B software, some B2C, and a couple of my own startups. And then started focusing about 8 years ago on this discipline of category design.
Yeah, Peter, you mentioned you're a big traveler guy in your bio. How did traveling help open your eyes to the world of sort of design and marketing and early on in your career? And then we'll jump over to the TED side of where you guys met.
Yeah, I think, design in particular, I think I got a very different appreciation for through traveling. And I think, the thing that I really woke up to was the fact that culture makes a massive difference in both marketing and design. I think it's probably more obvious in marketing, but in some of my roles combined with travel, I got to see how different cultures operate differently. So when you go into, we were in the automotive design space for a while. And when you go in and see a design studio where they're designing, the next generation of cars, pretty different how it works at BMW in Germany versus Honda in Japan. And the same with, the video game business, game studios, Rare in the UK operates very differently than Nintendo in Kyoto, Japan. So it was really eye-opening to see people work in different ways, have different priorities, and such. And I think that really opened my mind to the fact that culture plays a role in so many different ways. And I think in North America, at least, my perception of we think of everything as kind of the same, and then when you get that appreciation for how people operate differently, I think it does make a subtle difference in how you deal with things.
Would you say there's a difference between working north and south of the border, just within the North American bubble?
The work is pretty similar. The approach to things is very different. I mean, in the spaces we're in now, tech and investing and things like that, I think there's a very clear, difference between the appetite for risk, in particular, on the Canadian side of the border versus the U.S. side, and it does kind of play into, this whole theme that we focus on, category design. That was initially created in a book called Play Bigger. And it's like, yeah, that's kind of the US philosophy, is about play bigger, versus the Canadian philosophy, I think is a little bit more conservative.
I could definitely agree with that. You both mentioned that you met at TED. Peter, you've been involved with TED conferences for over 30 years now. How did you get involved originally? And then maybe Deborah, how did the two of you really connect on marketing and design at TED?
I got involved in the early 90s working at a tech company in Toronto. We were invited to present what was called a 1-minute video idea bite to the conference. They just wanted to talk to all these tech companies and see what they were trying to invent in the future. So we agreed to do that and started into doing it. And then they said, no, we're not going to do that. We didn't get enough entries. But I was already registered to go to the conference, which I didn't really know much about. So I ended up going, and it happened to be the fourth TED that was held, and it was in Kyoto, Japan. It was kind of interesting because it had never been outside of Monterey. Did a few super interesting projects with the conference, and one of them was that I think is particularly relevant to this conversation. We actually created, as a sponsor of TED, social network for TED. So this was back, 20 years ago or so. So we created this social network, but the purpose of creating that was to demonstrate what a rich internet application could be like. So this is when websites were generally static. We were creating a new business category called rich internet applications at Macromedia, based on an underlying technology called Flash. And we actually sponsored TED to create this app to get in front of people what this future vision would look like, of, hey, what if you could have motion on a web page and user interfaces that popped out and did things like that lightning strike. But we didn't have that terminology back then of how do you go to market and kind of make a splash or something new.
That Flash technology was obviously very revolutionary. Deborah, were you part of that initial social network they created at TED where you guys met on a static app?
No, but I was a happy conference attendee recipient of it, and I loved it. I mean, I was such a fan over it. I really flipped. I thought it was fantastic. It left a really big impression on me. I mean, it's kind of neat for Peter and I, even though we didn't know each other, and for all those years, we only met during the pandemic, virtually, actually. But it's really neat that we had a lot of these historical firsts and insights and, places where our lives changed because different things happened to us at these conferences. So it's kind of a cool thread to have between us.
Yeah. I mean, you guys were like blind dating, but without actually meeting through TED conferences, which is really funny. But, let's jump into the topic today, which is category design. Deborah, can you explain what category design is, how it helps leadership teams define business strategy, and how it can be used to help dominate a specific category?
Category design it's about identifying a problem that hasn't been adequately addressed before and creating the solution that redefines the space by creating a compelling narrative that positions your solution as the only viable option, and then building an ecosystem around it and layering partnerships, strategic marketing, continuous innovation. So it's really about this initial communication of change, that something different in the world is happening, and continuing to communicate that change, just like grinding down on it.
And can you give us some examples of category kings that we would all refer to today as obvious kings, but maybe in the early days, we would not have thought of them like that, like a Google or ChatGPT or something like that?
The iPhone would be, the category king, that when Steve Jobs holds up a smartphone and talks about it, that anchors in your mind that anything in this category is going to be like this iPhone. So even though Microsoft maybe had, something or other phones with different features, this is going to be the thing. And actually, the iPad is the perfect example of that, because the tablet came first, and it was about feature sets and functions. But the story about the iPad was that your computer was too clunky and big and attached to your desk, and your phone was going to be too small for streaming everything new that you would want to have access to. I think that just created this thrust and desire for a tablet that you didn't even know, an iPad that you didn't even know you needed or wanted before that.
Right. And I think we all can understand what the word category king means. But I think going back to the original concept that both of you are experts on now is category design. Peter, what are the first steps a company should take when pursuing the idea of category design and going all the way down to like the startup idea?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is to learn what category design is and how it works, because there are these proven techniques for how you invent a new business category. And it really does start with that book, Play Bigger. So reading that book, it's the kind of original Bible of category design. And even though it's 8 years old now, it's still kind of relevant. And there are also, newer other books on category design in addition. But getting that fundamental learning of, hey, how would one approach this when you want to go create a new category? That's really the start. It's basically like any other design process you go through. This happens to be one that a leadership team is going to go through to redefine this new market segment that they're going to build. And, there are a whole bunch of steps to that process. But I think the most important thing you need to do before you start is decide if you're a risk taker, because really this whole process, it does involve taking a risk, because you're going to do something bold and visionary and try and create something new that doesn't already exist. Usually companies are up for doing that, but sometimes it's not a good fit. So you really have to assess, do you want to do something big and different and bold that's going to make a difference? So that's really the starting point.
Some companies may say, I don't necessarily need to create a new category to be category king. I can just carve out my own wedge and then grow into the category king into an existing category. Can you explain the pros and cons of those two approaches?
I really think of them as being pretty much the same approach, because it's really ultimately most categories are going to be some type of niche. And it's really, whether it's a subset of a bigger category or it's adjacent to another category, it's really going to take that same path, which is, how are we different? And it really all comes down to, if we're solving the customer's problem in a different way than other people are, then our solution is different. And if our solution is different, we can create a whole category that's sort of defined by what makes us different. And whether you start off as a subcategory and evolve, or really, have a new term out of the gate, I think, both of those can work. But ultimately, what you're trying to get to is a place where if someone hears this category name, they don't immediately associate it with a whole group of companies that you're competing with.
Please give us some examples, Deborah, that you have on the tip of your tongue of companies that are just creating categories that may not necessarily be what they are today, but in the beginning, in their mind, as leadership teams, they were new categories. But as a consumer, it would just feel like a nice niche or wedge into an existing one.
My mind was actually wandering a tiny bit as you were asking Peter that question, because I was thinking about ride sharing and just thinking, like, it's so obvious, like no one would have taken taxis just for the fun of it years ago, but then we're taking Ubers everywhere now, and now there's all different kinds of companies that are iterating on this ride sharing opportunity, and it's kind of magnificent how much it's going to change everything. Peter and I have seen a bunch of companies that are doing some really exciting things. And I just think that that's where, like someone stepped out in a category, it changed everyone's behavior. And that's just the beginning of it.
So what would those first steps look like for a company looking to take a step out in pursuing category design if they were to come and talk to both of you?
For a company to want to create a category and want to do that, they have had to identify, a pain point or an inefficiency or a gap in the market that hasn't been addressed, looking for what's missing, as Peter said, They're down for thinking differently. And then they probably have the problem of explaining that to people that don't understand it. And that's where Peter and I would come in. And that's where you create something new, but you just don't always know all the right ways to kind of get behind the program or the problem to help everyone understand it the same way that you see it. A lot of times when people create something or create a business, like they think, oh, that's it, I've created the product, but it's just really a small part of it. And creating the categories, that extra layer of depth, that's the opportunity to kind of get it across the line in a really big way, in a disruptive way, I should say.
I totally, hear you. It sounds like it's, a startup coming to pitch us as a VC fund has obviously got all their ideas of what the market is doing today, what the problem is, how their solution is different, how they're building proof points and getting their solution to be more validated. But because they're so close to the problem at hand and working so closely with their solution, it's hard for them to put that into words, into a story that helps it clearly set itself apart as a new category leader, potentially. And so having people like you that come at it from maybe a 10,000-foot view, or someone like us, can really help them think differently about the way that that category is being defined. But maybe, Peter, can you share a time when a category design effort just went totally awry and not as planned as what it should have been, maybe, if a company you've worked specifically with, or one you've observed from an outsider perspective?
The one that comes to mind right now is kind of a little bit ongoing, which is, we worked with this team from India who had a very compelling concept for how can we change how we interact to do business on the internet without so many distractions and things, and it was a very compelling vision. And we worked with them, and we really turned it into this, what we call a point of view, a POV, which is the category story, which is at the heart of category design. I mean, you have a new category name to convey, but then it's really, what is the story of the categories? Well, we call that the POV. So we worked with them. We developed this, I think, very compelling point of view, and they loved it. And then they looked at it, and they kind of started to have second thoughts, like, we don't know if we can deliver on this. So, this vision's really big, and we're not sure if we can do it. And right now, they're kind of evaluating pivoting to something actually a little bit less ambitious. I would call that a project gone awry, because I guess we made it too big, and you can make things too big. I mean, you can define a category as being too big or too small. And part of it is getting that whole piece right. But yeah, that's one that comes to mind.
Well, I think having the right kind of founder mentality as well, to be confident, but not too cocky, in the fact that they can be a category king is kind of important as well. When you say, like, for example, Brian Chesky and the founding team at Airbnb, creating that category of a shareable economy hotel chain, if you will, was probably a very scary and daunting strategy that they obviously were thinking about early on. But how do you think founders like that can sort of nibble their way through such a grandiose strategy and, creating this category before anyone else has even thought about doing it, without backing down and obviously falling to pieces?
It's a fine line between, getting that balance right. But, the example you bring up, Brian, at Airbnb is kind of an interesting one, because they didn't start off with a category vision. They had no idea really what they were doing, the way he describes it. They did one thing and it kind of worked. And then they did the next thing and it kind of worked. And they did the next thing and it kind of worked. And then they did get to a point in their growth where they thought, we have to define the category that we're in. And it really became a challenge for them, because they started off with, well, it really is this concept called hospitality. But that was too big and too generic and too much like we're going to compete with hotels. And then they did end up with a category called community-led hospitality. And that really started to help them internally define who they are. Like, customers may not talk about that, but it really got their focus clear in everybody's mind, because across the company, they didn't even know what they were doing. They just kept adding new features and functionality. Back to the genesis of the question of, how do you take on that bold thing? It really is that balancing act, because you have to be able to be ready to say you're going to do something new and different, but it can't be too new and different.
Right. For our companies at the early stage, they're obviously trying to think, a couple years ahead in terms of where the market is going. I'll also try to sell something at today's, value and prices for something that the market may not necessarily be ready for or understand. Deborah, what role does market trends and timing play in the shaping of a category design strategy?
Market conditions are obviously important if you're going to innovate. It has to be the right time. I mean, you want to catch something before it crusts and be the first to communicate it. And again, if the the idea is compelling, the story sticks. If it's just the thing can come and go. It's just information. So the story is the wind that really, carries an idea.
Okay. And any examples of where the market trends just totally thrusted a company to the spotlight when maybe they didn't even actually have the strategy fully fleshed out?
It's a bit repetitive, but I think that is what happened with Airbnb. They just had all this extraordinary growth just thrust in front of them because timing was right and there was need and interest in the service that they offered, even though they hadn't figured out what kind of category they were in.
And do you think also consumer behavior has an impact on, category design strategy? Because consumers are super intuitive, right? Like people are obviously influenced by media, pop culture, the economy, things like that. Do you have an example, Peter, of where consumer behavior drove a company into a more specific category king example?
One example that's on the newer side that we'll see what happens is there's a company called Radical Science that we work with, and they do basically consumer testing of products to see if they work or don't work, and really nutraceuticals and supplements and things like that. And I think what's happening with them is they've now said in a broad way, hey, consumers can participate in a panel and learn what works for them, to alleviate one of these issues they might have around sleep or pain management or anxiety. And it's sort of creating a new opportunity for consumers to try out products. They're going to be part of a formal test panel that's like a mini clinical trial that's ultimately there to help the company, but the customers get to participate and get to try something out at the same time. So there's a great exchange of value there. And I think that's an example of where, hey, this may be the new behavior for people that, before this category and company existed, no one would have done this, but it might be, a new way to find out what works for you on the consumer side, even though ultimately the customer of this company, Radical, is the supplement manufacturers. So in fact, the category that we worked with them to create, it's proof as a service, because that's the service that they're providing to, the nutraceutical manufacturers. Proof of whether their products work and which dosages work and which form factors work and which population does it work against and things like that.
I was just going back to the conversation I was asking Deborah about sort of companies that are hitting the right inflection point of where the market tailwinds, consumer behavior, and timing aligns when they're not the first in creating a new category. For example, wearables. I mean, how many different wearables have we seen come and go that were not as successful as the most recent ones? And the most recent ones that come to mind that have been able to withstand some of the biggest tech companies coming at them is Whoop, which obviously has thrusted itself into the spotlight among amateur athletes, but has also withstood a lot of severe attacks from, the largest tech companies in the world. I'm curious what you would say, Deborah, about how a company who is clearly trying to take the market leader in a place that category has already been established in terms of smart wearables can continue to maintain its position against incumbents trying to undercut them because they have pricing power and network effects and things like that.
I love that question. And Peter and I are actually working in the space pretty deeply, but I think I think with anything, it really has to be a compelling and authentic reason to use whatever the thing is. Like, it's not just like a woo-woo marketing story about it. It's like, really, what is the value? And then sharing the story of that value in a way that's really compelling and it should be differentiating. If they really have something to offer, then transparently, it is the power of how that's being communicated in a way so that someone is going to be intrigued, curious, want to try it, have satisfaction with it, change their behavior and tell their friends, and then retain their loyalty. So I think it's, having the efficacy of the product, but that first communication is really about the why. Like, why is this even a thing? Like, why do I care? Why do I want to bother? And I think you have that minute to kind of the really great reason that you birthed something into existence.
It sounds like taking those sort of anecdotal, qualitative feelings that people have when using a product or service and kind of wrapping it up into a story that has the category outlined on the outside of it. But on the inside, there are still tangible things that people have to agree with.
I love the way that you characterize it, because that is the thing. Because the category isn't your brand. The category is this open idea. So when you're having a conversation about a category, it's the problem, it's the thing out there. It sits above the brand or the item or the device or the wearable. But of course, all the components or the functionality, like your brand, fits it and solves for it perfectly. But when you're having the conversation about the category, you're not selling and pushing your brand. It's not even selling. You're talking about, you're having a conversation about the problem and the new way that it's to be solved and the opportunity that it is for everyone. So it's a really different, it's like an offering, and it's not, like, I'm me ego brand and I want you to buy me now because I'm better and also crush and kill the competition. It's a completely different conversation. And that's really why category is so powerful.
Yeah, I always love the stories of CEOs who have that aha moment when they're sitting in the bleachers of their kid's baseball game and they hear a parent talking to another parent about this new product that they fell in love with, and it's that CEO's company's product. But they're not obviously acknowledging the fact that they're the CEO. They're just listening in on this beautiful conversation about why they love the product. That's kind of what it feels like as a CEO to listen to one of your early customers tell another potential customer why they love your product without you controlling or penetrating the conversation. Wouldn't you agree?
For sure. Someone falling in love with the problem that you've identified.
But not having you contrive, obviously, the pitch for them is what I think a lot of startups can maybe get a lot of value out of early on in creating their own ideas around category design when going up against bigger players. Peter, how has category design evolved, I guess, with the rise of digital marketing and analytics and getting more into the quantitative side of things in your mind?
Designing categories as a process has definitely evolved since it was, put forward as kind of a formal discipline eight years ago. It's really about this high-level strategy that is a corporate level strategy. I don't think digital marketing, analytics has had a lot of impact on that, because those are really about the execution of how are we getting our story out there. So it's really, category design is so much about what is that high level story? What does it look like? And then, of course, you execute it. You need to execute on that in a powerful way. But that's always going to use what are the latest marketing techniques and what works to convey those things. So I think, the rise of digital marketing, I don't think has really impacted category design itself. It's just like everything else. You have to, roll with the times and be doing the most effective marketing you can to get that story out.
How would you speak to a founder of a company at the early stages who's still got a pretty good relationship, founder-led sales, let's say, towards their early customers? How would you advise them on incorporating the ideas of refining their category design process when they're doing their customer feedback calls?
When you're at that stage, category design can be a difficult project to take on. Thinking about category can be challenging because what happens is you have this momentum, and if things are working, there's resistance to change. We've seen this happen often where we'll go into an organization and define this great new category, and the vision's there, the CEO's behind it, and then it's kind of like, okay, the next step is we need to start selling in a different way. But you go to that average salesperson And they're kind of like, no, I'm not changing what I do. There's money on the line here. I know what I've been doing. I've been doing this for 3 years. It works. It works fine. I don't want to have a completely different story to go tell to prospects. So you do run into resistance in organizations, sometimes when doing something new and bold and different. So that's what I think is one of the challenges of this whole idea of, okay, it's one thing to create the strategy, but then when you need to go execute on it, there's so many things that you need to do that are maybe a little bit different than regular day-to-day sales and marketing.
It's a real challenge, for founders who are obviously very confident in their vision and what they think the product needs and is asking for. But when you have people on the front lines, like your salespeople, your AEs, whatever, customer success people, saying, no, I don't want to sell a brand new platform to a customer that I've been nourishing a relationship with over the last 3 to 6 months, or I don't actually align with your vision. Even though I know you're the CEO, I still believe we should be selling this suite of products versus what you have this brand category king, vision for. I guess, Deborah, can you explain to our listeners some examples of where a company redefined a category by going against the advice of their contemporaries or their industry and really broke through the innovation side to become a category king?
One company that we work with had totally re-envisioned how clinical trials were done. So I don't know how familiar you are with them, but clinical trials, like when a big pharma company or has a device or a medicine that they want to get approval of, they create a clinical trial and it gets housed somewhere. And then it actually usually gets turned into pieces for how it gets supported. And if there's any one piece that isn't in compliance, then it totally invalidates the whole trial. And it's not like, oh, okay, we'll do it again next month. Like, that's it. It's kind of like you get one shot. This company that we did a category design project with created, basically figured out all the flaws in how clinical trials were undertaken and created a sinuous way of taking beginning to the end, and then supported it with live people being able to take people who are participating in a clinical trial in their homes and do whatever needed to be done to complete the test and have full compliance. And there were a number of all sorts of revolutionary things with that. And I think that was something that was big. It was so big. It had tremendous impact. And they're in the midst of making this disruptive situation. And it really challenged how everything is done and the way the clinical trials are supported. So I think that's really something that's live in process right now.
Wow, that sounds incredible and very risky for sure, especially in such a highly regulated industry like pharma. I think, going back to the example of ride sharing, Uber, in the face of sort of people telling them they couldn't take on, the unions or the taxi cab industry in New York, totally broke the naysayers down and defined a category in a true face of adversity and almost like government intervention at times, obviously, and threats of some serious legal blockages. So I can definitely say that was one example that came to my mind. Peter, what have you observed, I guess, in having category design being absorbed and used as a way to persuade investors and stakeholders to buy in to supporting the company in its next vision?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's really, that's one of the two key stages where category design can have a huge impact on an organization. One is when you're going to market to talk to customers, but the other is when you're talking to investors. And what happens is if you are inventing a new category and you have that amazing story of what that category is going to look like and how 5 years from now it's going to be this multi-billion-dollar thing and it's going to change the lives of people and all of these great things, that is a great framework for the investor pitch. So it really, that's one of the two areas that we typically end up focusing with organizations on is, hey, how are you going to fundraise? And if we can invent this new category, that can work really well with investors. Now, of course, there are some investors who don't want that. They just want to know the TAM, the SAM, the SOM of some big existing market, and we're going to get a 3% market share. But I think that kind of investor is declining in compared to the ones who are like, no, we want to back people who are doing something new and different, and it's going to be massive. And yeah, we don't know exactly how big it's going to be, but it is different.
What about founders who are a little bit nervous about going to their board with this brand new kind of pivot strategy that they're going to potentially get a lot of pushback on from their maybe not as risk-taking board members, let's say? How would you advise them on trying to look at a pivot into a new category positioning in a way that they get obviously as much information ready before they go into that board conversation?
The primary piece of advice, it's probably a very typical one, and it's one about balance, because you need to show these investors you're doing something new and different, and it's going to be differentiated and you're going to be successful. And then I think there are a lot of different techniques for how you can de-risk that by demonstrating, there are these adjacent categories or adjacent segments that have demonstrated the need for things like this, but we're different, and just kind of play that game of, we are doing something new and it's bold and different, but here's some data that's going to show that it's not that risky, because we've seen these other things happen around our spaces.
Mm-hmm. We've had a few companies, obviously, with the rise of Gen AI, come to us as board members and lead investors and saying, hey, we have to rebuild this entire software stack. We have to re-platform this company to be able to keep up with some of the demands we're seeing, or else we're dead. And when they came forward with the data, with the customer feedback, and where the market was going, and where they would not be in existence if they stayed with the status quo, it was a very easy decision for us as board members to jump on board with that. But you're right, coming forward with that data with a balance makes a lot of sense here. Deborah, I would love to hear your thoughts around what does a founder need to see in terms of the first signs of success to know that there is category design taking hold in the market for themselves or maybe some competitors that they're looking up to.
The impact would be market share, brand recognition, consumer engagement, revenue growth, money from investors, all those things, strategic partnerships, people that, jump out and want to work with you. All those things, I think, are things that would show that, a category is kicking up and people are paying attention and wanting to be a part of it. And it's solving something, and people are excited about what's being solved.
One of the real first signs that we look for traction is when the category name gets used by third parties. So that's really, when an analyst or the press, mention that category name, that's our first giant check mark that, okay, we're on track. This is working.
You have some examples of that in your portfolio. I remember you telling me.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly happened over and over. But the piece where if you're the competitor and this starts happening, then it's definitely a challenge, because you need to decide. It's like, are we going to participate in this category and battle it out? Because that's certainly an option. You don't have to be the category inventor, to be the one who's going to lead it. Or are we going to try and do, a zag and have our own version of category? And I think, one of the biggest, most clear examples of category design was this, company that invented this category. They'd competed for 12 years with 2 competitors. 3 of them all had similar market share, and this one just totally knocked it out of the park with a new category. But it actually turned out that one of their competitors had used that category name a couple of years earlier, but never made any hay of it. They just kind of put it in their boilerplate and didn't really go to market, didn't really have that category exist. And then, this other company went out and did it. And then, 20 times the valuation a couple of years later.
Unbelievable. Looking ahead, this question is for both of you. What emerging technologies or trends do you believe will influence category design the most? Starting with you, Deborah.
I mean, AI, obviously, the Internet of Things. I mean, I just think that AI, these new levels of personification, efficiency, connectivity, and the ethical questions around it.
Everything comes down to AI, at least, top of mind right now. In terms of influencing how category design is done, it's not clear to me that there's an emerging technology that will really provide a shift to that. One thing we have observed is the moment that you understand category design, you see businesses through a different lens, and you see people creating categories all over the place. And otherwise you wouldn't notice it. And I think what's going to happen is, at least for the next number of years, that trend is going to just continue, because the approach is such a powerful strategy. So I think we're just going to see every technology that's going to help with communication will be leveraged to get people's story of how their category is new and different out into the world.
Yeah, interesting. One question I didn't actually have on the docket that I should be asking both of you is, one, what is your favorite category design king in the market that we've all sort of partaken in and used over, your lifetime that you still cherish today when you think of that category leader? I have one in my mind. It's Costco, big box retailer membership club. Like, that's the category, right? So it's a membership oriented. So there's a bit of exclusivity cachet to it, with incredible value and sort of clear ROI associated when you walk into a Costco. You're not getting gouged by a retailer because of the model. That's one of the biggest ones in my mind. What about you, Peter?
It's interesting because I don't think they have a clear category, but for me, Sonos, the music system, speaker system, is kind of this amazing breakthrough that created this different category, this different way of doing things. I don't think have leveraged it to the degree that they could, because there is no, it was initially a wireless speaker, one of the first of those, but it's now so much more. But that's a area of product that I think is just, I've always had an affinity for, and I think they continue to do great work. And I think they actually have the opportunity to add nomenclature.
Sonos has some of the best speakers. Our house has it. What I love about the product is that I can obviously have one Spotify account split on multiple speakers around the house and stuff like that. But what I hate about it is they're still really bad at software. If they can only figure out the software piece to be just as good as, Spotify itself or other YouTube music is fantastic, they would have such a killer product that you couldn't turn off forever. But I'll leave it there. For you, Deborah, what would yours be?
I would say it's Patagonia, because it's like, we know Patagonia is like amazing in so many ways, but yet it doesn't have like the thing. But we know that it is a category unto itself. It isn't just sustainable. It's just renewable, sustainable. It's just kind of like intelligent retail, intelligent consumerism, intelligent, I don't know, but I know that like, that's what's so cool, is that everyone kind of knows Patagonia's different, but what it is could be even hyper defined, and then it could create even more traction. It's very powerful. It's a leader, and it's, beginning to end. So it's working on the full cycle of things, and it's unafraid, and it's, it just does everything different.
Very interesting. Two very different and unique examples there. Well, I guess all three of them, but we'll leave it there. Next is our fast favorites. We always ask our guests. So first off, your favorite podcast. We'll start with you and jump over to Peter after.
Darknet Diaries. So like focuses on the dark side of the internet, like hacking, cybercrime, data breaches. Like if you want things to keep you up at night, or like push creativity in a dark direction.
Mine's an oldie but goodie, been around a long time, 99% Invisible, 99 PI on kind of...
What's that about?
It's on design, all types of design. Roman Mars, the host, he'll dig into architecture or graphic design or the design of cities. And I always find it intriguing. I always learn something.
Very cool. An audio-based podcast about design. Interesting. Next is your favorite newsletter or blog. Start with you, Peter.
Mine's a new one in the last few months. It's a newsletter called Never Enough from Andrew Wilkinson out in Victoria, BC, of the Tiny Companies. And he's just doing his kind of, hey, this is what came across my desk this week type of thing. And I find that just kind of fun and interesting.
Yeah, we know those guys well, and we actually looked at some deals with them as well. So very small world. How about you, Deborah?
There's one called Human Times. It curates like the latest developments in AI and robotics and other human-centered technologies.
So many AI newsletters and blogs. I can't keep up with half of them, but I'll make sure to check that one out. How about your favorite tech gadget, Deborah?
I'm ready to have Neuralink put in. I'm ready. I'm ready for the upgrade.
You want the software upgrade to your brain? I hear you. One day too.
Mine is one you may not have heard of. It's called a Beacon 40. And it's a light that blinks in the 40 hertz range. It's expected to ward off dementia and Alzheimer's, because when you see a light at the 40 hertz range, it throws your gamma waves into a sink that can cause you to not have amyloid plaque form. So yeah, there's a bunch of research on this.
How long do you have to look at it for?
You look at it for an hour a day in your peripheral vision. So you don't need to look at it. You just like have it on your desk off to the side.
So you just have a strobe light in your room all day long going.
It is. And some people have them like one in every room, and it's always there when you're walking around.
I'd rather stick to my sauna.
It's like an older person's disco.
But it's like super slow. Super slow. That's hilarious. Okay. Favorite new trend for you, Peter?
I think it's about to happen. I think it's going to be very exciting. It's going to be human-created content instead of AI-created content.
I don't know if you're being satirical or not, but maybe you're being satirical.
I think we're going to have a return. Okay. I think very soon.
And we're going to knit our own clothes as well and forage for our own produce, for sure.
Yeah. I think people are going to be so sick of AI-generated content that we're going to return to craftsmanship.
I hear you. That would be good. All right. How about you, Deborah?
Peter's ahead of me on that one because I'm down with the idea of co-intelligence. So I'm buying all in to, any kind of supplement that's now available, both that you can ingest and then you can use your fingers on a keyboard for. So I feel like the co-intelligence is the new trend.
Yeah, we all definitely want to coexist with things that makes our life easier, but doesn't take over us as human beings for sure. And how about your favorite book, Deborah?
My favorite book today is Peter Attia's Outlive. I think it's just fantastic, but a classic favorite book. And I know you only asked me for one, but it's Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities. And it's a conversation between Kubla Khan and Marco Polo. And it was written over 25 years ago. But that idea of the mashup, I just think is it's always interesting. Like whatever it is, any mashup is just fascinating.
I would give a second to Outlive by Peter Attia, but then I have to say Play Bigger is my favorite book.
I feel like this podcast is sponsored by that book for sure. And last but not least, your favorite life lesson. First to you, Peter, then over to Deborah.
The very simple realization that things just don't go as expected. Over and over and over, things don't go as expected.
Mine is different. It's universal permission. You have universal permission, so go for it.
Just go for it and become category king. Thank you so much to both of you, Peter and Deborah, for joining us in the tank today.
Yeah, this was fun. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Tank Talks. We hope you found today's conversation as insightful as we did. If you're enjoying the show, we've got 3 quick things to ask of you. First, hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode, whether that's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcast, or YouTube. Next, follow us and stay up to date on upcoming episodes and behind-the-scenes content on social media with Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. And lastly, share the love. If you found value in today's episode, share with a friend or colleague who'd benefit too. Your support helps us bring in more amazing guests and keeps the Tank Talks engine running. That's it for today. Until next time, keep disrupting and innovating.